In the second half of this lecture, we're going to focus on occupational stress and stress management. Now, job stress is something that many of us have experienced, and it actually is the result of a very complex set of factors working together. Our cognitions, our emotions, and our physiological responses all play a role in how we perceive and deal with stress. Technically, job stress is a situation in which job-related factors lead us to change psychologically or physiologically in a way that leads us to function differently than we would normally function. Stress, in general, is the body's response to demands in the environment. Using that definition, job stress is our response to the demands of our work, of our job, of the organization. There are at least two different types of stress, the good kind and the bad kind. Eustress is the type of stress that motivates us, drives us, gets us out of bed in the morning. Distress is the negative kind, the kind that we typically think of and dread. Distress makes it more difficult for us to do our job, for us to function normally. Two different types of stress, but they both involve thoughts, feelings, and a response within our body, a response that sometimes we don't even know is happening. In the early 1900s, no one paid attention to job stress. It was not a topic of concern. Today, we know that occupational stress is related to a variety of negative outcomes for both the individual and for the organization. I have some of those costs here. At the individual level, impaired physiological and psychological well-being, increased counterproductive work behaviors, things like showing up late, leaving early, stealing pens, being mean to your colleagues, increased accidents, and increased violence. At the organizational level, it might increase the risk for emotional distress lawsuits or lawsuits related to accidents that are related to job stress. These are just some of the costs associated with job stress. We will talk about some of the other consequences of chronic job stress in the rest of this lecture. All of those consequences can cost organizations and individuals money. This figure depicts the relationship between stressors, the things that cause stress, and strains, the outcomes of stress. You see some examples of stressors. Things like poor lighting and interpersonal conflict can certainly lead to job stress. And we see some of the consequences, the outcomes, things like anxiety, depression, and turnover. This relationship between stressors, stress, and strain is impacted by personal factors and situational factors. We'll cover some of those individual differences at the very end of the lecture. So let's start by taking a look at stressors. Job stressors are those things to which employees respond. Things like physical task stressors, which you see at the bottom of the screen, excessive heat, noise, and light. Repetitive tasks might be physical task stressors. We'll look at psychological stressors on the next slide. All of these things are instigators of stress. They are the things in our environment that cause us to experience stress. There are several different models that attempt to explain how stressors cause stress. I have two examples here, and I won't go into depth about them. I just wanted to show them to you so you kind of understand maybe why you sometimes feel stressed or why your employees feel stressed. The demand control model suggests that stress exists because people don't feel like they have enough control over their jobs. When job demands are high, but we don't have a lot of control over how we do the work, that creates stress. When job demands are low and we don't have a lot of control, it's not as big of a deal because there aren't a lot of demands. High demand jobs should allow for more control on the employee's behalf. The second model, the person environment fit model, suggests that stress is influenced by the compatibility between the person and the environment. We might look at person job fit, we might look at person supervisor fit, we might also look at person organization fit. If employees don't fit in the organization, with the supervisor, with the job, it can cause stress. It can lead to conflict. It can lead to frustration and disappointment. It can lead to an incompatibility that makes it difficult for us to do our jobs. These two models highlight two important concepts: control and compatibility. These are two ideas that we always need to be thinking about when it comes to occupational stress, both in terms of our own experience of it, but also our followers, the people that we end up managing in the future. Think about the amount of control they have, and think about the fit with the job and the environment. There may be things that you can do to help them adjust their perceptions, their behaviors, and in the end, it may be that certain individuals are experiencing too much stress and either need a different job, a different organization, or a different environment. Sometimes job stressors exist within the job itself, and sometimes they are more psychological in nature. So let's look at some of the different psychological stressors that we might experience. One of the most common psychological stressors that researchers have identified is perceived lack of autonomy or perceived lack of control. Autonomy is the extent to which we feel like we have control over our work environment, that we are empowered to make decisions about our work. When people don't have control, when they don't have say in how they do their work, but they have a lot of demands, it makes it difficult for them to reach those demands. Now, perceptions are key. We need to work on perceptions of control. It may be that an employee actually does have quite a bit of control, but they don't realize it. They don't perceive that control. Interpersonal conflict is another type of stressor that we might experience. This can be anything from a simple argument to physical violence at work, but not getting along with our colleagues can lead to stress. It can lead to an increased heart rate. It can lead to digestive problems. It can lead to absenteeism and turnover. Therefore, it is considered a psychological stressor. Role stressors are a group of different role-related stressors. Role ambiguity involves unclear expectations, uncertainty about what one is supposed to do in a role. For many of us, the first day of a new job can be full of role ambiguity. We don't know what we're supposed to do. This causes stress. This causes us to think negative thoughts. It can cause us to maybe feel nervous. Maybe we have butterflies in our stomach. Role ambiguity is common in a lot of jobs. Role conflict involves incompatible demands. Your work role might conflict with your role at school or your role at home or even your role in the community. If you need to be at two places at once, for instance, this is going to cause conflict. That conflict then causes stress on the body and on the mind. And then we have role overload. When we have too many demands, when there are so many things that we need to do that we just don't have enough time to do them all. Not being clear about our role, having a role that conflicts with other roles, and having too much to do in a role, all three of these things can cause stress. Emotional labor and shift work can sometimes also lead to stress. Emotional labor involves the regulation of our own emotions in response to the emotions expressed by people in the environment. Emotional labor requires us to suppress some of the emotions that we might feel and express emotions that we don't feel. We call this surface acting. When you express an emotion that you aren't feeling. When you smile, although you're feeling very frustrated, angry, or even sad. Deep acting is a more intense form of emotional labor. Deep acting involves a more intensive transformation. With deep acting, we actually feel the emotion that we're being asked to express. So let's say you're at work and you're in a bad mood, but your job requires you to interact with the public and put on a happy face. If you use deep acting, you actually convince yourself, you change your mood, and we often use cognitions to do this, thoughts to do this. You change your mood to suit the situation. Of course, deep acting is a little bit more difficult to accomplish, but it has better outcomes. It is better for our body and our mind to use deep acting. Some of you may have a rotating shift where your schedule changes on a regular basis. Some people might work during the days for a month and then work during the night the next month. Then the third month, they're back to working during the day, and so on. Rotating shifts can be extremely hard on the body specifically, also on the mind, but also on the body. It is not natural for the body to constantly be changing its sleep cycle. So people who have rotating shifts may notice some sleep disturbances. They may also notice digestive issues and issues with appetite. These psychological stressors, along with stressors associated with the work environment or the task, they all contribute to the stress that we experience in the workplace. Any one of us may be experiencing all of these things at the same time. Many of us learn to deal with them, learn to cope with them. But nonetheless, we can still experience negative outcomes. So let's look at some of those consequences of job stress. And we're going to focus on distress, on the negative outcomes. Job strains are the consequences of stress, the outcomes of experiencing stress. We can divide these different strains into three different categories: behavioral strains, psychological strains, and physiological strains. Behavioral strains include things that are more observable, things that we can count or measure easily, things like absenteeism and turnover, violence, accident rates. Behavioral strains also include impairments in information processing, things like reduced memory, reduced reaction time, reduced accuracy. Psychological strains include outcomes that are not easily seen, not easily observed. Things like anxiety, depression, problems with sleeping. The individual may be able to recognize these things internally, but it's difficult for anyone else to understand what this person is experiencing. That's why psychological strains are so important for training programs. We need to help people identify some of the early warning signs of chronic stress, of chronic strain, and help them make the necessary changes before it turns into things like heart disease, stroke, arthritis, and high blood pressure, some of the physiological strains. Look at all the different things that we might experience as a result of job stress, and especially as a result of chronic job stress. Stress can change our behaviors, it can change our psychology, our well-being, and it can change our bodies. It can actually destroy the heart muscle and lead to heart disease. Psychological burnout is a very serious psychological strain that we sometimes experience as a result of chronic job stress. Burnout technically is an extreme state of strain that results from prolonged exposure to job stress. And there are three components of burnout: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and low accomplishment. When it comes to emotional exhaustion, many people who are suffering from burnout cannot process emotions at that time. They have had it when it comes to experiencing life. Some people can't feel emotions. They are numb to the emotions that they normally would feel if they weren't experiencing burnout. When it comes to depersonalization, some people who experience burnout treat others in a not so nice way. And it's not because they're bad people. It's not because they're mean people. It's partly because of the burnout, because it is suppressing their emotions. It's affecting their perceptions. It's affecting their physiological responses to the environment. So don't take it personally that the person who is suffering from burnout isn't very nice right now. It probably has a lot to do with what they're experiencing internally. Low personal accomplishment. People who suffer from burnout find it really difficult to get their work done. Again, they've just had it. They don't want to open the laptop. They don't want to go to work. They don't want to fill out another report. They don't want to do anything. Not because they're lazy, but because they're experiencing burnout. There are two important risk factors that researchers have identified: perceptions of injustice and lack of social support. When these two factors are present, and when they're present together, we should be more concerned about that individual potentially suffering from burnout. We should also pay attention to individual differences, things like perceived control, and whether the individual has any of the qualities that we're going to cover on the next few slides. Each one of us responds to stress in different ways. We each have different qualities that help us cope with life's demands. There are a few qualities that are associated with higher levels of stress. People who are neurotic, who have a tendency to be emotionally unstable, have high stress levels, and people who have a type A personality also tend to have high stress levels. These individuals are incredibly ambitious, competitive, they can be impatient, and reluctant to rest, which is one of the reasons why they suffer some of these strains that we just talked about. In fact, type A personalities are several times more likely to have heart disease as a result of job stress later in life. There are several personal qualities that are related to lower levels of stress. People who have high self-esteem, who have a positive global evaluation of their self, and people who have high self-efficacy, who believe that they are competent, capable, and efficient individuals, they tend to have lower levels of stress. Type B personalities, people who are calm, patient, relaxed, tend to have lower levels of stress and are less likely to develop heart disease. People with a proactive personality are excellent self-regulators, and they can change their behaviors to match the situation, to help them overcome obstacles in the environment. More recently, researchers have identified a collection of personality traits they call psychological hardiness. These traits help people overcome life's demands. A sense of control over one's environment, called internal locus of control, a sense of purpose and commitment to the job, and a tendency to perceive obstacles as challenges that need to be overcome, not as something that is daunting, something that is annoying. People who have high levels of psychological hardiness take on challenges and overcome them with persistence and dedication. These traits allow people to resist stress, and they don't experience it to the same degree that other people do. Fortunately, there are a variety of ways that personnel psychologists and managers can intervene. Using principles from occupational health psychology, we can make changes that improve people's work lives and promote safety, health, and well-being in the organization and embed it within the culture. At the bottom of the screen, you see some of the examples of the things that we can do to have an impact on job stress: recruitment and selection, training, play a role. Those systems that we've talked about earlier in the semester can have an impact. Perceived control, social support, practice, time management, physical and mental fitness, and psychological hardiness. If we can enhance these different aspects of the employer-employee relationship and of the work environment, we have a better shot at helping employees manage their own stress. Here is a model of what we might focus on in a stress management intervention, the different types of interventions that we might use, and some of the outcomes that we might pay attention to in order to assess whether that intervention worked. When it comes to the targets of our interventions, we need to pay special attention to the stressors, the things in the environment and the psychological stressors. If we can reduce the number of or the intensity of those stressors, then we should be able to have at least a small impact on job stress. We also need to pay attention to the psychological stressors, which involve cognitive appraisals of the work environment. So we need to think about people's perceptions of the work environment and their attitudes toward the job, the supervisor, or the employer. And we also need to teach employees how to more effectively cope with job stress. Not everyone has this skill set. So if we can teach some people how to cope with the stress that they do experience, then hopefully they won't experience some of the strains of chronic job stress. There are different types of interventions. We can focus on the individual level by teaching employees how to meditate, how to relax, how to reassess the work environment from a cognitive perspective. We can also teach them how to set better goals and manage their time. At the organizational level, we can think about the impact of structure as well as job design on employee stress. We may be able to change things about the job to allow for more control or more challenging work. Selection and recruitment practices will need to adjust in order to choose people who are better suited for the environment. We might also use training and development opportunities to teach people new skills and help them balance the different roles in their life. If we implement some of these interventions, we should be able to experience some of the positive outcomes that you see in the right side of this table. At the individual level, we might see a reduction in health indicators, things like blood pressure and heart rate. We might be able to improve quality of life and things like anxiety and depression, as well as things like job satisfaction, organizational commitment, and other job attitudes. At the organizational level, we should see an increase in productivity, both in terms of quality and quantity. We should see an improvement in turnover rates and absenteeism rates. We might also see a reduction in the number of accidents on a yearly basis. Ideally, we implement interventions at both the individual level and at the organizational level. We can also think about interventions in terms of how they address the stress. Primary prevention strategies are proactive and preventative in nature. They are designed to prevent stress from even happening in the first place. This might involve changes to the job, to the technology or the equipment used on the job, or to the organizational structure. Cognitive restructuring is an individual level strategy that helps people prevent stress from becoming a major issue. This is the process of changing the way we perceive stress. Instead of thinking about stress in negative terms, we learn to embrace it, to welcome the challenges involved with stress. Flexible work schedules might also help people prevent stress from happening. If they have more control over when, where, and how they work, they are better able to adjust in the moment to the demands of the situation and to what they are experiencing in terms of psychological and physiological stress. Primary strategies are preferred because they prevent stress. But let's face it, stress happens. So we also need ways of helping employees deal with the stress that they do experience and address any strains that they experience. Secondary prevention strategies can be preventative or reactive. Damage control. It just depends on the strategy and the person. This includes things like helping people learn how to eat a more healthy, balanced diet, encouraging them to exercise, to quit smoking, to quit drinking, and teaching them how to use relaxation techniques to remain calm in the situation. Conflict resolution training can help people deal with interpersonal conflict. Tertiary prevention strategies are reactive in nature. They help people deal with the strains that they are experiencing. And in some cases, it involves recuperating from chronic strains, things like heart disease, anxiety, depression. So this third level is focused on treatment and healing. It might involve things like medical care, psychotherapy, and career counseling. But these tertiary strategies happen after the fact. These are not the strategies that we want to rely on. We want to focus on the primary and the secondary prevention strategies, and we want to focus on things at the individual and the organizational level. Some of you may have access to what are called employee wellness programs and or employee assistance programs as avenues for dealing with workplace stress. These two different programs are slightly different. They have a different focus. Employee wellness programs are focused on preventing stress, and employee assistance programs are designed to help employees deal with stress once it's already happened. Both of these programs are associated with positive outcomes, like attracting better employees, retaining better employees, reduced insurance premiums for employee wellness programs, and higher productivity and lower accident rates for employee assistance programs. With wellness programs, we're usually talking about things that are promoted within the company. An employer might provide some type of incentive to encourage employees to eat better, exercise more. Assistance programs are often administered by outside organizations. There is evidence that both of these programs can be cost-effective if implemented correctly. The money that employers invest in these programs can help reduce the incidence of workplace stress, which then reduces the incidence of all those different strains that we learned about earlier. On the very last slide of this semester, I want to cover just a few of the things you need to do if you decide to launch an employee wellness program. First, make sure you start small, especially in organizations where this is new, where this has never been done before. Start small with simple programs and distributing information to employees. Once that information has been introduced into the culture, then you can start to build on that early success. Also, let employees participate in the planning process. Let them come up with some of the ideas that form the foundation for the program itself, including the incentives that are attached to the behaviors. Conduct a survey of your employees to figure out what they are interested in terms of activities and also the rewards, the incentives. Make sure you schedule events related to the wellness program during the workday, during lunches, during breaks. You don't want people taking time away from their actual job to participate in these programs, but you also don't want people to have to come back on the weekend or come back at night in order to access the program. Use the benchmarking process to look at what other companies in the area and in the industry are doing. Psychological burnout might be a common strain that employees in a specific industry experience. If you know that, you can look to see what some of your competitors are doing to help their employees combat that burnout. And finally, consider connecting some of your employees to community resources. to nonprofit organizations or government agencies that also provide services that your employees could benefit from. So let's put all of this together. If we want to help employees manage workplace stress, we need to pay attention to factors at the individual level, the organizational level. We need to help them prevent stress from happening, as well as cope with stress once it happens. We need to involve them in any programs that we design, make sure we understand exactly what it is in the environment that's causing them to experience this stress. And we need to make sure that managers, top leaders, and even employees at lower levels, we need to make sure that everyone understands that the organization cares about its employees and that there are services available for employees to utilize in order to manage their stress. That is it for the final lecture in personnel psychology. Thank you for investing your time this semester to learning more about organizational behavior. I hope you've learned a thing or two to help you better manage your own employees or to pursue a career in personnel psychology. Thanks again for watching, and I wish you the best of luck this week.